Yeah, I wasn't sure how many we should expect to join or anything like that, but welcome everyone that's here already. I'm Nick Blasier, and I am going to put on thank you Marianne and Bernard for inviting me to do this Backgammon Sunday thing too. I think it's really cool. So thanks to the World Backgammon Federation for organizing things like this. But yeah, I'm going to present today on opening score cubes. So when to send, score cubes in the first couple rolls, and I'll talk about terminology, but it's going to be focused on third and fourth roll. I'll explain exactly what that means too. But as you probably know already, I have written a book. We'll jump to that right away on adjusting to match play, and in there I talk a lot about the most common, I guess, the like a good starting point for match play, which is these 4-point match scores where all the intricacies of the cube can change quite a bit. And so in that book, I go through a lot of double fives references, and I show that what is a small no double, if we know this position for money for normal scores, can easily become a pass at the most sensitive scores. So this is 4-way, 2-way that we're showing, and it's still a pass at like 4-way, 3-way, and 3-way, 2-way as well, though smaller. So I go through kind of a lot of positions there and introduce some of these like window methods and things like that. For David Presser always talks about it as like if like where the window opens up, like close to a double for normal score and money play, is often where the window is closing at these most sensitive scores. And so that can be kind of a useful heuristic for understanding how to adjust your cube action. And it's also nice to be able to compare that with some references that we've seen a lot. So after you've been studying backgammon for a little while, many players are familiar with these double fives positions and exactly what they would do for money. And so it's not too much of a stretch to remember how they change at these scores too. And it kind of gives you a good grounding for adjusting your cube strategy in the opening, both as the leader on the take pass side and as the trailer having to double more aggressively. Um, so there, so yeah, this is also a fourth roll position. That's how I'm going to describe this today as we play. And this sequence is arrived at when white opens up with a 5-2, we'll say, and or sorry, a 5-1, or yeah, it can be either. We'll say a 5-2 for fun. Black follows up with double fives and blitzes. You can see white has played a checker off the midpoint to the 8-point and split. And then white rolls a 3-2, a 2-1, a 6-2, anything that enters one checker. And so for money, when we enter deeper, there's not enough material in the zone and the checker's a little too far out of the reach for the blitz potential to be effective enough to want to send a cube, but it's very close. And at these scores, at this position turns into a pass. But so to me, this is the fourth roll, and that 5-2 is the first roll, double fives was the second roll, the entering 2-6 was the third roll, and we're about to have our fourth roll as black in this position. And so any cubes that would occur before the fourth roll, I'm describing as fourth roll cubes. So we'll go on from there, and do pause me and ask any questions if you have any questions about any of these things. But yeah, I guess briefly too, before we get into it, the characteristics of this, why this is, if you haven't gotten into the book already, I described quite a bit in adjusting the match play. But it has to do with at 2-away, when you send the cube, your opponent is never going to send it back. So you have less risk in offering a cube because you don't worry about it coming back later, which means that there's a higher premium on getting the cube in before you lose your market, and a lower premium on being careful about having to deal with a recube later. Additionally, at 4-way scores particularly, the value of a gammon can go up quite a bit, which I show how to calculate in that book as well. And so if at a normal score, the gammon value is around 0.5, meaning that a gammon's worth about half as much as a win. At 4-away, it tends to be worth a full 1, exactly as much as a win. And your opponent's gammons, once you send the cube, are 0 or greatly reduced. So you're going to play more aggressively for gammons too, and that factors out in the numbers. And so we can see already up here that we have a monster pass when we have 60% wins plus 27%, we'll say gammons for an adjusted wins of like 87%, something like this. And so you don't have to know the exact take point to know that that's well past our normal point of last take of 75 to 80% range when we have recube options at normal scores. So that's kind of some of the basics. And I show in the book, a few reference positions in the opening and how weak we can be to send a cube at 4-away, 2-away. But I realized it'd be really nice to sort of solve that out in a way too. But let's go really quickly here. I just want to show as well, I described what a fourth roll position was. And yeah, so for normal score play, we never really have a cube decision until this fourth roll. And I'll show that in one of these upcoming positions too. But it tends to be that, our best opening roll, if we win the first roll, would be a 3-1. And no response to that is weak enough that for money, we would be ready to send a cube. However, in normal score play, when we can roll a double or hit a checker and put it on the air and they can fan, all these kinds of things, then we can have cube action that early in the game in the fourth roll. So it does challenge our intuition about positions a little bit if we're used to money play to try to evaluate what the cube action might be on the third roll, at these different scores when we have to think about it. So I think that's a lot of why people overlook things quite a bit. Another common fourth roll position that we see as a cube is when our opponent splits with that same 5-2, we roll double threes and make 2 points, and our opponent fans. This one is also not close to a pass yet for money, but it is a sizable cube, right? So these can come up. And I'll show some less common ones that come up on the fourth roll too that I'll be adding to the book. But it's kind of really nice, even for money play, without even bringing score into it, to study these because we can get an intuition. Now we don't have to think about it ever on the third roll, and on the fourth roll we can start to get an idea of like how big of an advantage we need to have to be able to start thinking about the cube and kind of take some of the guesswork out of these like odd positions. So early on in my cube study, this is David Presser's done a ton of work on this with, I forget the name of who he worked with, but has shared a lot of like work on that with me. And I think he's posted articles in the USBGF Primetime magazine and things like that too. But here's some less common fourth roll cubes that can come up. A really fun one to me is when our opponent white opens with 5-4 by playing 2 down off the midpoint. We follow up with the double sixes, and our opponent follows up with the double sixes as well and is forced to give up their 8-point and leaves a shot here, right? Might not be one that you're used to thinking about, but now you have this reference of like, okay, if it's destructive enough, I can have a small cube. And if you continue this study, you'll also find that if they're not leaving a shot, not burying a checker to the deuce point, it's generally not quite enough with the double sixes to draw a cube this early, but it can happen. And so it's something that you can watch out for. And another one that comes up that can already be a pass is if white splits with a 3-4 and then we roll double fours. I'd have to look this up again. I think this might not be the best way to play it, or it probably is. Sorry, it's not for certain. But if we do play by hitting the checker in the outfield and making the 4 on head, and then our opponent's unlucky enough to roll one of the 4 numbers that fan, we have a double and our opponent has a pass already on the fourth roll. So these can come up, we can have passes after the 5 blitzes as well. And so you'll notice too a theme from my book. If these are close cubes like the top one, the double sixes, then at 4-away, 2-away, 3-away, 2-away, 4-away, 3-away, you can count on these being passes as the leader already. That's how we're going to adjust in those in general. So let's move on here. So as I mentioned, for money, potentially, I think this isn't our absolute highest equity sequence. We'll get into the difference there, but this probably is the most volatile and the most likely to draw a cube. It's if we open with a 3-1 in points, our best opening roll, and our opponent splits to the bar in response, we have a pretty clear advantage with like not quite 60-40 game yet, but some gammons involved too. But this is still not enough volatility to want to send the cube and risk having to take it back when our opponent performs for money. But at scores, this is going to be a fairly clear cube. And I decided to lecture on this specifically today because I was just at the Cherry Blossom tournament last week, and two like top level US players both encountered positions like this where they weren't aware that at 4-way 2-way that this is like a crystal clear cube. And it's actually, if we go look at that now too, it's not a small amount of equity you're giving away by not doubling this. This is already a massive cube, and we're kind of getting close to the take pass borderline. And we can get into the math to figure out why that is. But at 4-way 2-way, when you roll your best and your opponent just splits in response and invites all this volatility, there's more gammons, it's a very large error to not know to send this and take advantage of the gammons, and you're going to lose your market a lot. So at a minimum, we have to know that like a good pointing roll like this, like we have to have our eyes open to it for sure on the third roll at 4-way 2-way. And as I decided to go through all of the openings and responses and figure out just how weak we can be to have a 4-way 2-way cube, kind of a lot of features of that, I found that at 3-way 2-way, this is good enough for a cube as well. So some of our best openings in the third roll can be cubes even at 3-way 2-way without that full 1 gammon price, which I don't know if it was surprising to me, but there's more of them than you would think. So you can have, after very strong openings, cubes at 3-way 2-way as well. And I'll talk about some rules for that. But in this best opening at 4-way 3-way, it's not quite enough. I mean, you can call this optional, is kind of how I'm talking about it in the book. It's only 0.002, so if you decide you want to send this, I see no problem with that. But it's easier for me to remember that after, you know, the most likely cube sequence on the third roll at 4-way 3-way, we still don't quite have one, so we can just sort of remember this as never on the third roll at 4-way 3-way, or at least it's always optional not to send the cube, and we can kind of categorize it that way. And I mean, a lot of, I guess, things that come into that, of course, the gammon price is higher, but our opponent does have some cube value. They can potentially send it back. We like to claim a little bit better, things like that. So yeah, this is, as I said, like a very, like probably the best opening sequence we could have as far as cube action goes. And it gives us an order of strength of these sensitive scores as well then, where 4-way 2-way is very clearly the one that you have to adjust the most at and be most careful as the leader and most aggressive as the trailer. And then 3-way 2-way is like a fairly distant second. And then 4-way 3-way is a somewhat close third from that. And you can definitely come up with exceptions where the additional gammons in a position will make a cube at 4-way 3-way a pass, where it can be a take at 3-way 2-way, because at 4-way 3-way the gammon price is much higher, where at 3-way 2-way the cube is dead and the take point's a little bit lower or a little bit higher. So deeper in the game you can find where they don't follow that order. But this is a fine rule for the opening, at least, to treat them as 4-way 2-way, followed by 3-way 2-way, followed by 4-way 3-way in order of strength. So when else do we have an optional cube at 3-way 2-way or better? You know, once I saw that with a 3-1 point followed by a 6-3 split, that we did have like a somewhat clear one, I was curious how weak our opening could be and still have a cube at 3-way 2-way. And so as a general rule, if you want to remember when you can cube in the opening at 3-way 2-way, I found that a 3-1 point followed by something weaker. So not a pointing roll, not a run to the midpoint, not a set. If we're just splitting or running or playing down, something like this, that can be enough for a cube at 3-way 2-way. And we also have after 4-2 points, it's generally, sometimes it'll always kind of bounce back and forth on the borderline there. And you can see again, like it's actually 0.002 shy after running. So I still consider this an optional cube and find it memorable to remember. But we're already learning some things about like strength of different running plays and what the breakdown is there too. I think what you'll find in these is that while the equity might be higher for the trailer to split, it's it's often going to draw the cubes most aggressively. And running is a little bit less volatile. You know, there's better upside, so it tends to draw cubes a little bit less. And then where our opponent plays down, it actually can be worse for them, but it still might not introduce the volatility needed to want to send the cube quite yet. And so we'll look at some examples of that too. But so here's some examples of a very strong pointing roll at 3-away, 2-away, followed by running rolls that are going to be right on the cusp of take pass. And if we see these numbers, then we can extrapolate from here too, that if we roll a 5-3, well, maybe after like a really weak split, we'd have something, or a really provocative split, but probably not after running at that one. And some things like this, you know? And in the book, I'm going to lay all of these out so you can look at them all. But for the lecture today, I kind of wanted to give some rules of thumb where you can navigate this a little bit more comfortably and have some idea of where you're at 3-away, 2-away. And it's definitely a much smaller problem space than 4-away, 2-away. So as I talked about with the split versus down, this is a really good example to me. After we open with a 4-2 point, if our opponent rolls a 5-4, they should split. And you can see here in the comparison between the split and the down, once we're on our cube action, that after our opponent plays down, our equity is a full 0.1 higher. We're doing much better. Or yeah, we're doing much better after our opponent plays down. But we have a more favorable cube with less equity after our opponent splits. And this is something that Dirk covers in detail in his Theory of Backgammon book. But the cube action isn't always representative of the best play. That's an important thing to remember here, that we still really desire to split and have an anchor at a trailing or at a leading score. And even if that does induce a cube, it's still the better play. It's still the better way to get out of these gammonish scenarios. And it's not better to just like slowly die by playing down necessarily. So this comes up quite a bit. And I think as far as practically how to address this on the cube side, I would probably still choose to generally send the cube after down plays, but know that it might be marginally less exciting to the bot at these kinds of scores, you know? You'll see there's not a huge difference between them, as you can see, but you can see it just has like it's starting to favor the volatility quite a bit. We're going to hit loose on the 5 point very often in this follow-up when our opponent splits. And so we need to cash in on the upside, where there's just less swing on rolls when our opponent plays down. Any questions about that so far? Sweet. Well, this is one of the many lessons for me that came out of studying the opening cubes here so far. I'm still working on that book too. But so as we move on, I wanted to see what the weakest we can be at 4-away, 2-away is as well in order to send the cube. And as a general rule, if our opponent makes a better point than us or rolls a set or hits us, something like this, they're going to gain the advantage in the opening after we slot, something like that. So we can kind of rule those out and just only look at the ones where we've done something slightly better. And some of the more surprising positions as borderlines came out to me. On the left here, we have after we open with a 4-2 point and our opponent follows up with double fives and takes a massive racing lead. Apparently, this is structurally weak enough that we have an advantage in a cube and a threat of a gammon already. So that's a really neat one. Like there's a lot of lessons here where maybe we wouldn't even known that we were the favorite after that roll, unless we kind of studied this at the score, right? But so after a 4-2 point, of course, then if you have a 3-1 point, you must be doing even better. And a 5-3 point is a little bit too weak to send the cube against double fives because we don't have the same priming and purity that we did before. And same story after the 6-5. After our opponent runs, you know, we're barely favorites. We have some gammons, but the structural advantage is enough here to start bringing, you know, I guess, just the threats at the score. It's another one that jumped out at me at four-way, two-way, where it wants to send a borderline cube here. And I think it's interesting, of course, we can memorize this for our cube action, but there's also lessons about strength of rolls and knowing backgammon deeper, that the 6-5 is actually a pretty weak opening. And it's sort of apparent when we look at it here and see that we already have a cube after making a point. And same with the 5-5. You know, it tells us a lot about relative strength of openings by studying this too. One that I think more players are familiar with, I think many players know that after making the 5 or the 4 point with a 3-1 or 4-2 that we often have a cube at four-way, two-way. But I think I remember explaining this quite a bit in commentary, that even after a 6-4 point, we're often going to have a cube in the opening as well. So after we point with the 6-4 and our opponent plays 3-2 down, you know, we don't quite have it, as you see in these scenarios. Again, when our opponent plays down, there's less volatility, so less incentive to get the cube in early, but it's quite close. You know, it's not too far off if you want to send a cube like that. And after our opponent splits with something like a 6-3, comes out and provokes on the bar point, then we have a fairly mandatory cube. It's getting pretty sizable to miss that, and we're going to miss our market a lot if we hit and our opponent fans or enters poorly. If we can imagine in the bottom right scenario, hitting on the bar point and our opponent entering in split even, right? Now we have a 9th checker in the zone, and having seen a lot of the references that we did, we must think they're under a lot of pressure in this position and like be unclear about whether or not they're still in the takeable sort of window, you know? So these can be easier to find when we think about it that way. I think making pointing rolls and also making a deep point like this 6-4 should be relatively intuitive as to why you would have a cube as well. If we categorize this as a more gammonish position, we should probably think that we want to get in cubes more aggressively after an opening like this. I think what's a lot less intuitive is when we open with a slotting or a splitting roll, and how often we have borderline cubes even after those. So I pointed out at least one of these in my book and got really curious just how weak it can be. And I found, as a general rule, if we play down or we slot and we're missed, our opponent doesn't make a point, anything like this, that is generally good enough for a cube. That will generally already have taken a small advantage there and be threatening some gammons. And it's already time to send, just on the threat of an improvement. And we can see, again, why that is, that in both these scenarios, we have an extra checker in the zone. We're likely to have a very strong point. And we know with just 8 in the zone after the opening on the 3rd roll against the split, we already have a strong cube. So the 9th should be pushing us close to like not certain about taking or passing again. So yeah, I think if we think about it that way, it's not too surprising, but we're not really used to thinking like I played down in my opponent's split, I have an advantage, right? So unless we've studied these score examples. But yeah, I found this to be like a very useful heuristic, just if they do something weak. I believe that we'd likely have a cube after splitting and getting away with it too in a lot of cases. But in general, when you're the trailing player, you shouldn't be splitting. You should be slotting, you should be playing down, doing something aggressive and arriving in this position. So it's a lot more relevant to look at these slotting and down plays and what the follow-up is relative to them. You will certainly find things that are like exceptions to the cube or borderline and things like that, but it's all going to be relatively like within this kind of 0.02 to 0.03 kind of window, where if you're sending an incorrect cube, it's not going to be by too much. And so this should function as a pretty good simplification. The only thing that I've found in the openings, this, if we think about it this way too, we've covered now all of our pointing rolls and all of our down and slot rolls, which are going to be all of them except for 6-5 in the opening. And so I found also in looking at this that the only roll that's never enough to double at 4-away, 2-away is 6-5. And you can see it's not by too much after the weakest split here. I went through dice distribution and found that the weakest response according to XG was a 4-1. And we can see that compared to the last positions, if we look at these where we were sending cubes, we have 53.7% winning chances in the top one after our down play. And after the 6-5, we're up to 56. So we might have more wins than a lot of positions here. But again, what we're seeing is that function of volatility, that not as much is likely to change and lose our market after running with a 6-5. And so we have less pressure to get that cube in. So this is the only one where we can categorically wait, is if we just run with a 6-5. Any questions about all these so far?
No, that seems to make sense to me, Nick, because yeah, there's no real four-way player. There's no real great structure. It's just a race. Yeah, like that's not the sort of situation he wants to get into, I suppose, with a turn cube against a two-way player.
Yeah.
So yeah, certainly not strong enough to cube. Yeah, it makes sense.
Cool. So we have just a couple other extending into the fourth roll now from here. So now that, I mean, we've basically, you can say we've like solved the third roll, right? Of course, there's more to study through to know, like if you want to know with granularity, but you've got a good sense, hopefully from that, of what's going on there. And so we can use that knowledge to understand what's likely going on in the fourth roll in a lot of cases too. So in a situation like this, where we open by, or our opponent opens by splitting, we point on head and they fan, it shouldn't be too surprising that on a deep point like this, that we're really close to the take pass borderline at 4-away, 2-away. And what that means is that if we split higher and get pointed on higher, then we probably will have a pass. And if we get attacked all the way on the deuce point, maybe it's a little easier to take, kind of closer that way. But yeah, maybe where if we haven't sort of studied through the positions the way we've just been doing, it might not be clear at all if this is enough advantage or not at 4-away, 2-away to even send the cube, right? But we'd be missing out on a lot by not sending this. The most likely follow-up is that we just bring 2 down. And when our opponent doesn't immediately anchor, then they're very unhappy to be against a point and 10 checkers in the zone and things like this. So yeah, this is like a fairly intuitive extension, I feel like, of the third roll positions. Another one that'll come up. So we know that pointing on head's going to be pretty strong, making a point, all that. But what if instead of that, they're on the board and they just haven't done that much? This is awful similar to us making a 5-3 point and our opponent splitting with a 5, and we know we have cubes after that. They've made a little bit of progress, but deteriorated their structure here. And so after our opponent opens with a split, we just point and they don't anchor. Then we still have enough for a cube here. We've found some advantage there as well. And it should be another one that on the fourth roll isn't as surprising if we've studied through those third rolls and have an idea of like where all the sensitivities are there. So I think, yeah, one other one that I have here. So the last positions we'll go through are like the categories. But another one that I've studied quite a bit is just kind of game flow after an opening double sixes. And I think I got some good heuristics on this from Albert Steg at some point. I think he had made like a cool like study flashcard system about it too. But the very common scenario for money on the left there is that after an opening double sixes, once we have an additional board point compared to our opponents, then we often have a cube and they can have a pass even. But as long as our opponent anchors or has a better board than us, then, you know, it's often not even enough for a cube at that point. And they can comfortably take if it's pretty even on board strength. And so that's a nice way for money to navigate these very common double sixes opening kind of scenarios. And in the opening too, that means that generally for money, we're going to play pretty aggressively. Whereas white in this scenario, we're going to put checkers in front of the anchor a lot. We're going to try to make an anchor and we're going to try to play really pure to gain on board strength before our opponent can. And that's very important to staying alive in these double sixes scenarios. At 4-away, 2-away, however, I looked this up, how to play so in this one, it's what did we open with? A 5-1 in split, and then black rolls 6s, and then white rolls a 4-1. At 4-way, 2-way, we can't even afford yet to play that aggressive. And the best we should do is to make the 23 points already. We need to start tightening up and just have an anchor and not get blitzed off the board. And so our strategy is going to be completely different here. And we already have close to a pass just after this sequence. So it's another reference where if we've looked at how close it is to a cube already for the money play, that should be fairly intuitive that we're close to the pass on that side. But I also find it interesting just how much harder it is going to be to even play the same game plan after an opening 6-6 in this one too. And so I think studying these cubes can kind of teach you some lessons like that at the scores as you compare them too. We just clearly don't have the same path to victory available that we did for money because we're going to lose too many gammons. So we just have to immediately make a 23-point anchor and sit on that and hope for the best, which is not an exciting plan, right? Any questions about that one?
It's safe.
It's a hard play to find. If you don't make it, then you can just pass, and that's probably easier, right?
Yeah, I think that, I think the score sort of like pretty much highlights it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool. So in summary of all that, the general rules that you can remember from this is that at 4-way, 2-way, after on the third roll, essentially any advantage, which can be as much as just both of you being split and you're on roll, or your opponent being split and you're on roll, that's going to be enough to send the cube in general. And so, of course, making a point is going to be enough as well. And so after you point and your opponent's in some sort of split position, then it's no longer optional too. It's like mandatory and very important to find those cubes, and you're going to lose a lot of equity if you're not sending them aggressively there. After 3-way, 2-way, if we open with one of our best 2 pointing rolls, a 3-1 or a 4-2, that's enough often after our opponent doesn't do much either, just splits themselves to send a cube too. And so that scenario can come up quite often. In the 4th roll, many of our reference cubes that aren't quite enough to send a double, if we study the 4th roll, those can become passes. They can switch to that side. And that's a very common occurrence as well. You should assume that anything you would even be thinking about sending a cube for money on the 4th roll is likely to be a pass at 4-way, 2-way, and even the other scores as well. And then finally on the 4th roll at 4-way, 2-way, use our same any advantage kind of rules. You've seen pointing rolls be enough and like splits and things like that. So if we get to the 4th roll and our opponent has managed to not do anything with either of their 2 rolls, then often we'll have a cube on that. And so as I go through this, you have that adjusting to match play book that talks more about fundamentally how all this score cube stuff works and how to address it in the middle of the game. What I'm working on is a book to follow this up now is just, as I said, going through all of the 3rd roll positions and showing, which ones are close, which ones are clear, and just giving you a full reference of everything you'd have to look at. And then I intend to continue into some 4th roll money references as well and show those and go through as much as I feel like makes sense representatively on the 4th roll. It's easy enough to go through all 3rd roll possible cubes, about, probably like half the difficulty of learning all 2nd roll replies or something like that, since many of them are just clearly our opponent has an advantage and we don't have to think about it. But yeah, the 4th roll already gets quite a bit bigger, right? And so we're going to have already approaching probably thousands of positions where maybe we could have a cube at 4-way, 2-way. So I'll have to find some rules there and some representative positions to extrapolate it. But yeah, so I've been working on that. And after seeing a couple people struggle with that at the live tournament at the Cherry Blossom, I wanted to share some nice rules of thumb that I think you can go apply pretty quickly in your study. And so that's it for me.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much.
It's excellent. Yeah.
Questions, anyone?
Yeah, actually, Nick, I think it's very interesting. I learned a lot from this presentation, because when I looked at my own system, I tried to follow the same adjustments. So how would I actually do it in these situations?
Yeah.
And my system is not particularly good for early cubes at very close scores, like you know, 3-away, 3-away, and 3-away, 2-away. It's not particularly good at that.
Oh,
But what
interesting.
what I realized is that you have these very sensitive scores where the gammon value is much different from player to player. So, for example, 2-away, 4-away, it's very 4-away, 2-away, it's very sensitive. Where 3-away, 2-away, it's much less sensitive for the gammon price, the
Yes.
gammon value.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you actually need to adjust much less at 3-away, 2-away than you do at 4-away, 2-away.
Yeah.
When gammon becomes when you get more and more gammon. So, for
Yeah.
example, fifth roll or sixth roll, you will get into positions where there's much a bigger difference between the gammons, and then you will need to adjust much more at 4-way, 2-away than you need here.
Absolutely. I found that in writing my first book too. To me, getting a sense of how to send the cube at 4-away, 2-way, and how much you need to adjust is a little bit easier. Like it's outside of what we've looked at, but once you look at it for a little bit, it's relatively easy to recognize some advantage in the game with some gammon threats and start to get those in time. The harder part on that adjustment to me is actually the take pass side and how early we need to let the cube go in a lot of situations and how big those passes are. And so going through some references like this is kind of my best hope. And what I share in the book there too is like just if you suspect that if you watch your opponent at 4-away, 2-away, miss these kinds of cubes that you know, and then you arrive at a position later, like I'm just generally going to err on the side of passing those and just assume like it might not look like a pass to me, but probably they were supposed to cube, and so probably they've lost their market if they've improved. And but I mean it's tough. Yeah, they're just very different, and coming up with a formulaic way to understand how much to adjust at 4-away, 2-way is difficult. It's like a whole window and a half, right? Like very somewhat clear no doubles for money, as we saw, can be passes already at the score.
Yeah, so for me, Nick, I've always found with the 4-way, 2-way score as a trailer, it's I've always struggled trying to find the bottom of the window.
Yeah.
You know, because as you know, positions that are no double takes become double passes. I mean, like I know the 3-1-1, the 4-2, that you know where you make the point, they're up on the bar. That's easy, you know. But the ones where they're not up on the bar, but you have got the small advantage.
Yeah.
You know, they're the ones that I miss a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really good for me to nut this in, and so I don't let them get past.
Yeah, yeah. Those are tricky. And by the bottom of the window, you mean the take pass decision?
Yeah, at the earliest point. Well, yeah.
Oh, earliest
I mean,
point to double.
at the first opportunity that you have a proper reference double, close double.
Yeah.
Close double take, you know, because for someone who hasn't studied it, that's going to be really tough to find, because you know, I mean, like it's I find a lot of players now that don't know the 4-way, 2-way, or the other scores. They struggle with when to shift the cube over, because they're waiting for a position similar to what it would be a normal score.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
counterintuitive. So like it can take out the counterintuitive part of your game, because you know that things that you wouldn't even think about, that wouldn't even enter your mind for a money game, are actually the double takes. I think they're harder to find for the doubler.
Yeah. On the take pass side, I think it's so nice to have references like this particular one where we're very close. And if you put in the same variance, like how we would play it for money here, then this is going to be a pass already, probably a relatively close one still at the score. And so like this doesn't look like a whole lot, but having this as a reference of just like 10 in the zone and a racing lead can be enough to let it go already, can help us figure out, you know, when it might be enough, even though it doesn't look like much, to pass that 4-way, 2-way. And then, like you were saying as well, I really like the, I think, is this one a, no, these are the fourth roll ones. Yeah. I mean, these fourth roll ones are good for it too, but like really spending some time looking at this too to understand where it opens is, I mean, it's been incredibly helpful for me. Just knowing that in general, we split or we don't point, our opponent splits already okay to send the cube, that it can be this early. And so if it looks any better than this, then we know we're starting to get a fairly clear cube, right?
Yeah. So when you're playing your matches, then I mean, like when you come to the score and do you sometimes push it for another roll or two, possibly because you know that your opponent is unaware of what's going
Right.
on, or
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. That's a really interesting component of this is like this is all I've explained this from XG's perspective, from like game theory optimal or something, right?
yep,
But we are playing human opponents. And so when we send a cube like this, whether our opponent knows something about four-way, two-way or not, we have like roughly 0% of them passing, chance of them passing, right? So we are
correct.
creating some easy like leader decisions here, though it might be difficult to play the game out, so it goes both ways. So you could optionally decide that you want to employ a strategy of getting somewhere where they don't know they might have a pass. And maybe you actually are sending the cube earlier than you need to then if they're just going to take later too. So I do think
Yes.
adjustments like that can make sense. But what becomes important then is probably to know, like, where are we with this? Like how, so it's optional at 3-way, 2-way at this one, where we have, this is what I'm looking for. What's important to know is if we're going to, oh, sorry, this is, where do I, here we go, at 4-way, 2-way. I wanted to highlight here, if we are going to start to try to run tricks like that or adjust, we need to know that in a position like this where we roll our best in our opponent's splits, well, now if they might pass, we're potentially risking quite a bit. We're gambling with a lot more equity in a strong pointing roll where they split or something like that. So I would suggest that even if you're adjusting to players like at 4-way, 2-way, this is not the position to do it. And maybe some of those optional ones you can wait and kind of see if they can figure it out and give them a tough decision later. But if we hit and come down and they're split, like this is a fairly easy decision for our opponent in the follow-up sequence, right?
Yeah.
Potentially. They might still take it. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, for money, yeah, if you're playing against a money player,
Sure. Yeah.
That's their instinct. If
Yeah.
they're not really
Mhm.
understand the match translation.
Yeah. The other player dependent thing, I always, I don't do a ton of adjusting to players myself because we also might create more difficult cube decisions for ourselves down the road where we're less familiar, right? So we risk making our own like mistakes there. And we might get a pass and not have to play the game out, which maybe we miss out on an opportunity for our opponent to make mistakes there too if they don't understand the score well, right? So it is really gambling. You've got to be pretty confident, like where you're going to get this equity back, and especially if you're under time pressure or anything like that, it's very nice to know when you have at least an optional cube and you can just ship it and simplify. So to me, a lot of these more optional ones, like the 3-way, 2-way version of this, it's sort of like sending immediately at an odd away post Crawford score. Like you're always allowed to do it, and maybe you just want to do that. And if you want to get tricky and try to figure it out later, and you think you're going to figure it out better than your opponent, then go ahead, right? But it's kind of from a game theory
Yeah.
optimal perspective, you don't need to, right?
Yeah. So I'm thinking. Yeah. So I'm thinking at the 4-way, 2-way. That the opponent is probably more likely to err on his take than what he. On his pass than what he is his take because just visually it looks like it's probably like it's not a double. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So he's probably more. That's why I thought about maybe one roll to tighten things up a little bit.
Yeah.
Because because he might take the pass. I think that's just my thought anyway.
Yeah. I think that's reasonable. But then I think I thought of one more way that you can, like, when you haven't sent the cube yet, then a lot of times XG wants to play differently to creep up to a cube as well. And so you're not as incented to go all in on a gammon yet, too. So it simplifies your checker play. to get that cube in too.
Okay, because you haven't turned the cube, yeah.
Yeah. So you might find
Okay.
situations where you're just supposed to play simple and get to a clear pass, and you have to play a little bit more conservatively, or you can not do that, and just risk the swing the other way, which maybe is, I guess, good when it goes that way and you haven't turned the cube. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of factors. All the player
Yeah.
adjustments are kind of too hard for me in a way like that. I think it's hard enough to understand what XG is trying to tell us. So I try to learn that someday. Someday I'll have it all memorized, and then I'll figure out opponents too.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you play with the same people for so long, after like years, because I don't get out of Australia a great deal as much as I'd like to.
Yeah.
You get to know what their game's like.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Mick. Anything else from anybody? Well, cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys jumping on this with me. And I'll, of course, let everyone know when I have that whole book out, so you have the whole reference. And hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again, Marianne, for hosting this and the WBGF. And I'll pass it to you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.